Welcome Internet to Psychoanalytic Talk, and today we're going to be talking about the concept of identification with the aggressor by Sándor Ferenczi. It's a very important concept and one of the main ideas that Ferenczi put forward concerning trauma. So for Ferenczi, what he explains in this concept is that when something highly traumatic happens to a child, be it severe abuse, sexual abuse, moral abuse, humiliation, something really massive happens, is going to basically shatter something in the child. It's going to break something of himself, i.e., his development is going to be not just stopped, right, completely hurt. And in that hurt, it's going to create what I would call tears within the personality. These tears are there because something of the sense of being, what we would call the ontological being, is going to be broken at that moment because of the traumatic impact that the child cannot handle, that the child is confused about. Because often one of the main issues is that, for example, when we're talking about sexual abuse, is that the adult is going to basically tell the child that it's a form of love. The child isn't going to be able to understand it. They're going to keep it. They're going to basically feel ashamed. They're going to feel dirty, broken. And what Ferenczi explains is that that is because the child is internalizing, introjecting the guilt of the aggressor, i.e., they're taking all of that guilt, all of that fundamental core suffering, and they're basically internalizing it. They're putting it inside of them and making it part of their identity, because in that moment they're passive. They can't fight back. They can't basically report the adult because they're afraid that they won't be believed, or that basically the adult will or hurt them, or hurt their loved ones, or hurt their pets, or even in some cases say that they will commit suicide and it will be the fault of the child. So in a way, it's a form of blackmail, and the child is very sensitive and understands the gravity of what could happen. Therefore, they internalize it. There's no way out. So they take a part of what has happened inside of them. They carry the guilt and the blame. And what's going to happen afterwards depends on the gravity of both the event, but also how the child, in a way, was also able to identify with other people and be able to create an alternative through the love and care of people that didn't abuse him. So what's going to happen is that the child is basically going to split a part of their personality, a conscious part and an unconscious part. The problem is going to come with the unconscious part, because this identification with the aggressor is going to push the child into basically a traumatic repetition in which the child unconsciously is going to then grow into an adult and unconsciously seek partners that are like what the aggressor was, or because they were hurt deeply in the constitution of their being, they are unable to stop predators and aggressors from coming back into their lives. I have to stretch this because I think that vocabulary needs to be precise in this context, is that it's not the fault of the victim. It's never the fault of the victim. Problem is that they internalize it as it's been their fault. It's because they were too this or too that, or they were not this enough or that enough that it happened to them, or because the aggressor was in a deep form of despair, sadness, or mental illness, that basically what happened. Therefore, it is not the fault of the aggressor in the mind of the child that then becomes an adult. And this is problematic because without understanding that it is the fault of the aggressor for what happened, that means that the guilt can only be carried by the child, that the child cannot reattribute the guilt to the aggressor. And in adulthood, this can lead to the child basically being in a repetition compulsion, i.e. going back to basically other forms of abuse or abusers, like for example people that might then as adults might beat them, rape them, sexually abuse them, swindle them, and so on and so forth. A form of harm, an interpersonal harm, because they were never taught to protect. And that part of them that's still there, still is like a black hole pulling everything towards it. It is still relatively obscure. They're not necessarily aware of it. That they're not aware of all the hurt that has accumulated. That they have even identified with those bad parts, and those bad parts are still echoing within them. There might be understanding of it has an effect, but they're not quite yet been able to look at it because it's so traumatic. And we do know that in trauma, there is a risk when you look at it from the outside or you re-look at it. There's a chance that, or the person is afraid also of reawakening all the traumatic experience. And that's what Ferenczi points out, is that it can reawake, and in those moments it can be very extreme. Of course, if you've seen my videos on Fernburn, you know where this is going. That there is an uproar of the anti-libidinal ego for Fernburn, but Ferenczi doesn't call it like that. He says that those moments of crisis are almost psychotic-like because they're so intense. But what one has to understand is that it's the deep, deep despair of the child that's coming back. That fight, that struggle to save what can be saved of their identity before the break, before the trauma, and before the identification with the aggressor. This is not to say that there is only quote-unquote passive aspect to it. Unfortunately, in more severe cases, there can be an active identification with the aggressor, because as the aggressor basically breaks the identity of the child sometimes has no alternative than to model their whole personality onto the aggressor. In extreme situations, it can lead to the child then becoming an adult and reproducing the cycle of violence, abuse, hate, and neglect that was forced upon him, and might be a vicious circle of trauma that happens, that the child re-traumatizes other people once they become adults. They might become physically aggressive, sexually violent, conniving, and manipulative. That is because basically they were broken, and at that moment of being broken, they identified with the aggressor not becoming just a threat, but also an ideal for that broken child, means that their identity is molded upon the aggressor, meaning that they don't see themselves as different. In a way, they've merged with the aggressor, which means that it's so much more difficult to understand that no, this is not normal, that this was hurt, and that hurt can be stopped and should be stopped. Whereas in the more, let's say, more secondary, where it's more about seeking someone that will love like the aggressor, unconsciously of course, not consciously but unconsciously, there is more of a hope of being able to understand that this is not love. Whereas if it has molded completely the identity, it's much harder therapeutically to be able to detach oneself from the other. As often there is this idea with the people who have completely identified with the aggressor that no, it is the right answer, it is what is needed, it is normal, and this is basically complete fallacy, but a fallacy in which the individual believes, and this is jeopardizes both their psychic integrity, but after, when they become adults, the physical and mental wellness of others, and even of the safety of others. So one can see that this is a very pertinent concept, especially that we know that, for example, sexual offenders, for example, of young people, have themselves often, I think 80% of the time, if I remember this correctly from university, have themselves experienced sexual abuse. So this concept allows us to understand that there are deep ramifications, that these moments of trauma are deep moments where the abuser basically throws their hatred, their destructivity, and their guilt into the child that cannot defend, that cannot prevent this from occurring, that cannot take a step back, Therefore, they internalize it like a tsunami that comes onto who they are, breaking them and preventing them from having a linear development. And without the help of other people that will truly love them, that will truly make them feel as a human, as someone that deserves respect and not to be hurt, to be cared for. If they don't have those counter models, then they are really truly at risk of all basically not being able to protect themselves against abusers, trying to reach out to abusers thinking that this is what love is, and thirdly, becoming themselves abusers. So it's a real problem that, and Ferenczi was right to point it out, in spite of what psychoanalysis was at the time, to try and show us that yes, those ramifications are very important and it's essential for an abused individual, regardless of age, to be able to see a therapist, to be able to talk about it, to be able to restructure their personality, because the issue is that abuse doesn't go away on its own. It's something that needs healing, that needs to be talked about, that needs support, that needs people to be there in order to create an alternative. Because without that alternative, the only choice is identification with the aggressor, which always turns out to be a tragedy, both for the child and for the future people in the environment of the child. And this tragedy can be avoided. And even if the child is an adult, it's not too late. I am a firm believer that it's never too late for an individual to be able to work on themselves and try and mitigate the harm that they can do, but also, and this is important, to mitigate the effects by understanding what was done to them and realizing how much hurt was basically they were put through and how much hurt they had to identify with. So basically this is pretty much it for this video. Of course I need to end this on just on a little side note. There is also another concept of identification with the aggressor by Anna Freud, but they're very, very different. And at some point in the perhaps far away future, I'll make a video on the differences between both. But for now, just know that what I've talked about on this whole video was purely Ferenczi's perspective. I've injected a bit of Fernburn because I think that both models basically match incredibly well. And I'll have to make one day a video on that as well. But anyway, I hope you found this interesting, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.